Good morning. So I'll be talking about enterprise delegation. And just to get on the same page about what delegation is, as our starting point, I did a little web search for images on delegation. And these are some of the results I got. So you can see on the upper right, you've got what I think of as the big boss, the medium boss, and the little boss. And for delegation purposes, you can imagine that the big boss delegates down to the medium boss, who delegates to the little boss. And then he could have his workers actually do the work. And so this is one interpretation of delegation. And the thing I'll note here is that there is structure. There's, in this case, a strict hierarchy that you kind of delegate down the stack. But in any case, there's a structure involved here, and that's something that's true of delegation. I work in a fairly flat organization, and so we don't have much of a hierarchy. And so in that case, you could say that the delegation, when someone delegates to somebody else, you're almost imposing a structure on the organization. But in any case, you can either have the structure determine who delegates, or you could have who delegates determine or define a structure on the organization. On the left, we have a comic here where the king does not want to delegate anything. He wants to do everything himself. And I think this is another feature of delegation, that some managers just don't like to delegate. They like to micromanage and do everything themselves. And the thing I would say about that is perhaps they enjoy the sense of power and authority that they get from doing things, and they don't want to share that with other people. And they feel that by sharing and delegating it, that they're giving up some of their own authority or giving up some of their own power. And so there's one sense there. But on the lower right, I feel is the complement to that, that you have a big plate of hot dogs, and maybe you're not hungry, you can't finish them all. So in order to accomplish that task, you can actually take stuff off of your plate and give it to other people. You can delegate out the tasks that are either too much for you or that you don't want to do. And so you see this a lot with people. You know, the boss will get something like, I don't want to do this, here, you do it. And so you could see delegation as empowering you to do the things you want to do by getting rid of all the things you don't want to do, or just by sharing the load and enabling your group of people to do more than you could do alone. So these are different takes on delegation, just based on some images I found. It gives you a sense. If you look at the definition of delegation, or to delegate, the first thing I found is to entrust to another. And so in this case, it's like delegating your authority. You're trusting that the other person will do something along the lines of what you want it to do, that they'll represent you properly. The second one is actually to appoint as a representative. And you see this a lot with international relations. Somebody will represent the country in a negotiation, talking with somebody else who represents another country. And so they're not actually the presidents or the leaders, but they're actually representing the interests. And so they're a delegate. They've been provided that authority by the person who actually has it. And again, to assign responsibility or authority. And in some cases, you assign responsibility without giving the authority to complete it, in which case you're just giving somebody more work to do. But I think delegation works best when you give the responsibility to do something and also assign them the authority or additional authority to help them complete the task. And that's more what I want to talk about in this talk about enterprise delegation, is about assigning this authority to people. So I'll talk a little bit about an example here. And as mentioned in the introduction, I work with the Department of Defense, so the military is always around. So in this example, you have an Army general comes into the room and gives you an order. Says, I need you to transport this cargo from Washington, D.C., where I'm from, up to Boston. And you have different options for how to actually complete this task. So if you look at your options, you could drive it there. You could put it in the back of in your trunk of your car and just drive to Boston. Or you could use transportation. You could hop on a train. You could hop on a plane, depending on time and expense and whatever's available. Or you could ship it on an actual ship. Maybe if time isn't an issue, you just need to get it there. But you have all these options available to you for how to complete this task from the general. But you'll note he didn't give you any additional authority. So these are all options to you, or that were available to you before the general came and said, I need you to do this. And so these are all commercially available at any time to you. So let's look instead if he says, here's your task, transport the cargo, and I'm authorizing you to use any means available for transportation. And so, of course, any means doesn't actually mean anything. You can't go to the space shuttle and say, hey, I'd like to fly a loop around the Earth and land in Boston. I mean, you have limits on what you can do here. And the implicit limit here is that it's limited to what the general himself could do. You're authorized to act as the general. So your options now include the general's airplane. Or if you want to take a ride in his helicopter, maybe you could use that. Because you're now speaking for the general, you're doing something for him, representing his interests. And so when you go to reserve these aircraft, you can speak with the authority of the general and actually reserve these. And we've seen cases where this is actually true, that people are given orders and they actually invoke some of these to do things they normally wouldn't do. So enterprise delegation, in the general sense, is temporarily sharing access and privileges within some enterprise security framework. So there's, I think, three parts to this. The first is the temporary nature. When the general tells you to do this, he says you can use any means available. He's not promoting you to general. He's not making a permanent assignment that you can do this whenever you need. He's saying for this task, for this time window, for the time it takes to complete this, you're authorized to do what you need to do as if you were me, essentially. And so it's a temporary nature. It's designed to be temporary. It's not a way to do a permanent promotion. You don't delegate somebody a promotion. And it's about sharing of access and privileges. Like I said, you're not allowing him to go to a Navy and reserve a naval plane or a naval ship. It's an Army general, so he can do things within the Army. And so he's sharing his access, whatever he has, with you. He's not escalating above what he has. He's giving you just what he has, or some parts of it, the parts that are relevant for this task. And then the final part is you need an enterprise security framework. If the general signs a document and gives it to you, without the enterprise security framework, that's just a document. When you go to say, hey, I need this plane, the guy's going to look at the document and say, I don't know this guy. Who are you? You're just some no-name guy to me. Like, I'm not giving you this plane. Right? You need the enterprise security framework where he can identify the general, confirm that the order is valid, look at the signature and confirm it's his signature, look at your rank, look that you work for the general, and have these all available in a way that's secure and trustworthy so that he can actually make the assignment. So this is enterprise delegation, but my concern is how to do this in a digital age. If you're dealing person to person with somebody, it's a lot easier to do this security stuff because you see them, you know them. We're talking now about a group of, say, 1 million people in the Army. You don't know everybody. You can't know everybody. So you need a way to be able to deal with somebody you've never met, get an assignment from them, perhaps, and then convince somebody else you've never met that you have this assignment and that you need some resource from them. And you need this all to happen without personal interaction. So the general is somewhere in the cloud now at his computer typing, sending you orders that you see on your laptop. And you need to now turn this around and actually do something based on a pure digital interaction. So that's the challenge that I'm facing. Of course, the challenge is you don't know if it's the general. It could be some hacker somewhere who's sending you a message and trying to get you to do something. Or as we all know, on the internet, nobody knows you're a dog. Is this even a person? Is it an automated tool? I mean, we don't know what we're dealing with here. How do we assure that the person we're getting the message from and the message we're getting are authentic? So I want to talk about this security framework first, because without the security framework, you don't have an ability to do secure delegation. So we'll talk first about the overall security properties of our enterprise, and then show how we can layer delegation on top of that without breaking it, essentially. So I want to talk about enterprise level security. This is our method for providing security, and these are some of the basic properties that we're using in building this system. So first, we need unique and verifiable identities. Each person needs to have a unique identity, and a name won't do here because sometimes people have the same names. So in the military, we often have your first name, middle initial, last name, and then a number. So if you have the same name, you have a number that makes your identity unique. Or it could be an email address or something that just uniquely identifies you. Once you have these unique and verifiable names, so you need a way to actually verify. If I say, my identity is this, but I can't verify it, that doesn't do anyone any good. You need to be able to prove that that actually is your identity. So an email address, you could send them an email and they could reply, and then you can validate it that way. But there are other more secure ways you can use as well. But the point is, once you have that, you can go to the next step, which is end-to-end secure communication. It's nice to know someone's identity. You'd like to be able to actually communicate with them and to know that you're communicating to them, not to some man in the middle who's talking on behalf of them. And so this is the end-to-end nature. I'd like to actually communicate to the person I want to communicate with and know that our communication is secure from end to end. The next step is then we know the people, but we'd like to know information about them. And so when you join the enterprise, especially the military, there's a whole bunch of information that gets collected about you, maybe your name, your address, your age, your rank, all these pieces of information get collected about you, and then you develop more information about your position, your training levels, and your experience. And so we're constantly collecting information about people within the enterprise. This may be stored in different places throughout the enterprise, like human resources versus your particular division, but there should be a single source of information that is authoritative. If I want to know your rank, there should be one place that I know to go to get your rank. There shouldn't be 3 places keeping track of that, because if they get out of sync, you got to figure out who's right, who's up to date, who's correct. So we really want one single source for all the attributes at the enterprise level. And these are not, this is not what you had for breakfast yesterday at the club. This is about enterprise relevant information. Should have a single source. So now that we have this information, we can start to provide access based on rules, because we can now say, well, if I have data that I want to share, I know the information about you. I know where to find it. So now I can set rules based on that information that will allow different people to have access based on who they are. And I don't have to meet you in advance. So this is kind of getting towards that, not having to know everybody. I just have to know things about you or the properties of the person that I would like to have information or to share information with. And so once you set these rules, you have this idea that the data owner is responsible for managing their data and managing access. So within this enterprise, we'll have different data owners, and we want to allow the data owner to control access to their own data. And to do this, the enterprise essentially takes care of collecting the information, collecting all the rules, comparing it together, making sure someone has access, and then basically telling the people, look, if you're a data owner, this person has access because they meet your rules. But the data owner ultimately controls access. They're in control. And then finally, we need accountability. If somebody does something, we need to be able to go back after the fact. This is kind of a basic forensics issue that you need to hold people accountable for their actions. So that's enterprise level security, and that's our foundation for delegation. And the goal now is to provide delegation capabilities within this framework without breaking these properties. And the problem arises when you delegate because you're sharing access with somebody. And so you're breaking some of the ideas here. And so the challenge here is to actually implement delegation on top of this in a way that doesn't actually subvert this and break some of the security properties we already have. So let's look at some really bad ways to do this first, to give you a sense that it's not so trivial to do this. So we'll look at my favorite bad example, which is sharing passwords or even using passwords. So if I want to delegate, I'm the boss, I've got an account with a system, I want to let you use the system. The simplest way is, here's my username and password. Go do your thing. Right? This is an awful approach because we're just completely going outside the system. This is my account. I'm not supposed to share it with somebody else. They need to get their own account. So we look at all the things that we've broken now. We can't verify identities. When that person goes to access the service doesn't actually know who it is anymore. Given that they're sharing among people, you don't know if this is the real person or if it's somebody they shared it with. So you've broken that verifiable identity. As a result, you don't have this end-to-end secure communication because, again, you don't know who you're talking with. So you can't have security with the person you intend to talk with if it's not the intended person. The data owner has lost control of the data. The data owner assigned me an account. I turned around and gave access to somebody else. The data owner doesn't know or even realize that I've done this. They don't know who I've given it to. Essentially, I've taken control of the data by sharing it with whoever I want. So the data owner, again, has lost control of lost access control to their own data. And finally, without properly using accounts, you don't have accountability, because anybody could be accessing using my account. All right, let's look at a little different approach. Instead of sharing my account with somebody, I will tell the data source to set up a temporary account for this person. So now we have a separate account for them, a temporary account, so we have the temporal nature, and this is actually quite a bit better. The problem is we've broken the rules for access. We've basically said, I get an account because I meet the rules. This person gets an account because I said so, which that's not the rules. The rules are you need to meet certain restrictions about your attributes or your training or your position. And so we're kind of subverting that whole, the rule method. Another issue is scalability. If I'm assigning an account to somebody, through the data owner, that means that every data owner who has any delegation has to set up a separate account. And so setting up an account is not usually a trivial thing. You have to actually confirm that the person intending to set it up is correctly in a position to create the account. You have to collect some information about the person and set their privileges. And then you have to actually create the account. And more importantly, you need to disable the account or remove the account when the task is done. And that's the thing we often don't see, is the removal. So there's a whole management process here that gets really cumbersome when you have lots of data owners doing lots of accounts across the enterprise. But we're getting closer. So a third approach would be a public declaration. I say in a public place or in a public way, I intend to share my access with this account with this person here for this period of time for this reason. And so now we've satisfied pretty much everything. We've maintained pretty much all the properties we want. The problem is when you make this public, you have privacy implications. If I share my account with one person and another person in my group says, wait a minute, why didn't you share with me? They might start wondering, what's going on with that person? And so you might get some internal issues with that you're making all of this public, whereas a lot of the sharing, the accounts, you don't usually tell who has access to what. And in fact, the issue of who has access to a resource might itself be sensitive, especially in the military. Knowing who can fly that plane might be sensitive information. And so if I publicly declare that I'm letting this person do that, that could violate some of these properties or violate some of the privacy or security. Another issue is integration. There's no way that I know of to kind of in a standard way declare this and then use this in determining access. I could post this on my personal website. I could post it on a blog, maybe a bulletin board somewhere. I could post information like this. But I don't know of any automated way to bring this into the security architecture. So you're going to have an integration challenge here of actually declaring this information and then using it to provide access and then monitoring it, logging it, and all these things. So we're still getting pretty close though. We're almost there. So the fourth solution is the one that we're actually using in the work that I'm doing. And this is to set up a delegation service. And so we have a system of web services, and this is essentially just another web service within our security architecture. And this will provide all the properties we'd like, and it meets scalability because we've taken the load off of the data owner and consolidated it into the server. It can do all the work now automatically. We have privacy because the server is not going to share all the information. It's just going to use it to make access decisions. And we have a system that's well integrated because we've built it as a web service, which integrates well with the other web services. And we can assign it an identity and use secure communications just like anything else in the enterprise. So now that we have delegation, what are we going to use it for? What good is this? And there's different use cases, and depending on your situation, some of these may resonate, some may not. The one that I think is important is to what I call mend access rules. When you set access rules, you're trying to essentially select who gets access and who does not by setting a rule that kind of clusters people. A rule is kind of a logical expression. You either have this training or not. You have this many years experience or not. And so by defining your rule in the proper way using Boolean algebra and combinations, you can essentially divide up your population into the haves and the have-nots in some sense. You have access or you have not. But you're never going to be perfect, especially in the Army where you have 1 million people. It's hard to get every one of those right. And so the idea here is you could set a rule that's pretty close, and then use delegation to fix all the problems. If somebody doesn't have access and they should, you can delegate access to them. Somebody who has access can share it with them. And typically within an organization, somebody will have access, and if somebody doesn't, they know who to talk to get access. So it's a nice fix for that. You can achieve the scalability and kind of generalization of the rule-based method combined with the accuracy of setting up individual accounts. And you've actually decentralized it so the data owner doesn't have to worry about finding all the people who should have access. The people will kind of locally find a friend who can share access. And so you've distributed the problem, made it a lot more scalable. Another feature that emerges from this is when you use delegation, you're staying within the security framework. You're building on top of it, not going around it. And so as a result, you can monitor the delegations. And if you see a lot of people delegating access, that means your rule is probably not very good because there's a lot of workarounds. But it's all within the system, so you can see this. And you can use these delegations as a sign that, hey, maybe I should fix my access rule. And I'll look at the people getting delegated access and say, well, okay, maybe I can capture these people with a new rule and include them in the rule. And then you can essentially reduce the number of delegations. And this is consistent with the idea that delegation is a temporary thing. And so if you have a lot of delegations, that might mean you made a problem that needs a permanent fix. Another layer of improvement you can make is if you can't identify those people with a rule, you can talk to the enterprise and say, look, we need more information about our people. We need you to collect this and this and this, and then I can set a nice rule and we can automate access. So there's two layers here. You can help the data owners to write better rules, and you can help the enterprise to collect the information they need to write the rules. Another use case would be where there is no way to distinguish. You can't, you have 30 people in a group, and you want to have a group of 10 doing one thing, a group of 10 doing another thing, a group of 10 doing a third thing, but there's no way to distinguish between them. They're all, where I work, we're all staff members essentially. So there's no way to distinguish one from another. What you can do is assign all the access rights to essentially the leader of the group, and then they can delegate down to the people as they feel fit. As they form these groups, they can delegate access as needed. So it gives you the flexibility to actually provide access control within the system where there's no way to actually set up rules to do this. And finally, you can actually extend to external entities. If you have an external entity with a trusted identity, you can delegate to that identity, and then if they come in with that identity, you can essentially use an external delegation service to give them access to things. And you may need this with specific expertise in a particular area. You need an outsider to come in and help you, and you can provide them access for that time period, and then essentially cut it off by just removing the delegation, and now they are completely outside the enterprise, so they've lost all access. So just to summarize, I talked about delegation within the enterprise as temporarily sharing access and privilege within this enterprise security framework. And so we talked about the enterprise security framework and the properties that it should have to support delegation, and then how to build delegation on top of that, some ways that would not work, followed by the way that we think does work, that we're using now in our system of enterprise level security. And then we talked about how to preserve the properties, and again, how you can do different approaches that may or may not preserve them, and preserve the properties of the security architecture when doing delegation, so that you're building upon it and kind of integrating with it rather than working around it. And then we talked about the capabilities you can actually use with delegation, and some of the nice things you can do that make things either more efficient or more accurate in providing access control, and some situations that you might not be able to do that are now enabled. So with that, I will not be taking questions, but we'll do this about an hour from now when our other speakers have a chance. And I'll leave the floor to the next. Thank you.